Okay, well, thank you, everybody, for coming today. And thank you very much to Zaneta Kaszta for presenting seminar today and for helping contribute to our scientific community in these stressful times. Zaneta is a landscape ecologist interested in integrating tools from remote sensing, spatial ecology, landscape genetics, to quantify climate change effects and human impacts on wildlife and on natural ecosystems. She received master's degrees in both ecology and remote sensing from the university name that I will mess up, but try, Jagiellonia University in Poland. And she undertook her doctoral studies at Free University in Brussels, Belgium, which she completed in 2017. During that time, she had research exchanges at the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit of the University of Oxford, the U.S. Forest Service here in Flagstaff, and the Department of Environmental Sciences at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. She's currently a research fellow at the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit of the University of Oxford. And I wanted to note for folks that she is interested in applying for a research faculty position here at NAU. And that's why we also included her CV with the announcement. Relevant to that application, she has applied with Scott Getz and the Geode Group here at NAU for 2 NASA grants, looking at biodiversity and Getty project products. She has several other proposals under review, and I've been talking to her about potential opinion projects as well. So with that, let us welcome Zaneta Kaszta to tell us about using remotely sensed habitat data to model space use and disease transmission risk between wild and domestic herbivores in the African savanna. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amy, for this nice introduction and great pronunciation of difficult Polish names. I think you did a great job. Yes, today I will talk about a very up-to-date topic of disease transmission, but now for a change, not between humans, but between wild and domestic herbivores, African buffaloes and cattle. So just to give you a quick outline of the presentation, I will start with giving you a little background on the research problem. Then I will move to objectives and say something about the area of interest. And then actually the biggest part of the talk would be discussing components of the contact risk model, focusing on objectives of each component and outcomes. And then I will finish with some general conclusions. So this talk will be about foot and mouth disease, which is well known all around the world and causes huge problems and economical losses. It mainly affects cloven-hoofed animals and camelids. There are 6 serotypes in Africa of foot and mouth disease, and 3 serotypes are particular to the southern part of Africa. This disease has relatively low mortality, but the high morbidity causes huge losses in production because the animal which are affected by the virus has to be killed, and this has direct impact on the economy, the country economy, like South Africa, which is strongly based on meat export. Because countries where foot and mouth disease exists are affected by meat embargoes. In South Africa, this disease is transmitted via direct contact susceptible cattle and African buffaloes, which are carriers. And because of that, the country was divided in different foot and mouth disease control zones to separate areas of infection from the areas disease-free. And those areas were separated by set of fences. And that's one method of prevention. And the areas nearby the infection zone are unvaccinated. They inspected and applied some movement control of the cattle. And this is how the country looks like, divided in the different FMD control zones. This red area is Kruger National Park with surrounding protected areas, private protected areas, and that red area constitutes infected zone. And the area is separated here by a game-proof fence. They were starting to be erected since 1960s. And because of that, because this quite strong prevention system of vaccination and fences, South Africa actually received the status of FMD-free zone, which means that the country could export meat. But this finished just this year, this unfortunate year, also for South Africa, because there were two outbreaks, one in 2019 and one in 2020, which actually were occurred in the FMD-free zone. And it has been decided that South Africa lost the FMD-free zone status and cannot export meat anymore, which is a big problem for this country. And as I said, the main vector of foot and mouth transmission is African buffalo, which strays from the protected areas here into the communal lands. Since 1970, there were approximately 65 outbreaks, but they were mainly quite quickly controlled. So as you can see, this disease causes quite huge disruption and it should be controlled. And since 2020, the control gets weaker and weaker, and the finances and resources put into that control are also lower and lower because it's quite expensive. So therefore, there's a need to actually stratify the risk of foot and mouth disease, to allocate the resources in a more efficient way. Therefore, the main objective of this study was to create a model which would stratify contact risk between African buffaloes and cattle, and do it seasonally, to actually look whether they are seasonal difference between that contact risk and how do they look like. And to do that, we had to first investigate the space and resource used by both animals, African and cattle, to understand the dynamics, understand the movement. And to understand those dynamics and understand how animals behave, we need to look into fine-scale vegetation properties, because the fodder, the vegetation, is actually something which drives animals' behavior in this ecosystem, herbivores' behavior. And for that reason, we use high-resolution satellite imagery. So those are the three main objectives of this work. And talking a little bit about the study area, as I said, the study area is actually focused in the zone of interest, in the zone of possible direct contact where the disease can spread, which is Kruger National Park, this dark green area, the light green area, which is private game reserves, and then this area here is communal lands. And here, those, I don't know how well you see it, but those dots are actually animal occurrences from GPS locations. And our study area, the main study area for case study for the contact risk modeling is this red square here. It is actually scene of Worldview 2 imagery. And here we have a little bit of zoom in, so we can see that. So this is this little square of Worldview 2. We see here communal lands with some settlements here. We see in the south Kruger National Park. Here are private game reserves, and all over here is a fence, but fence of very different quality and different properties. And quite often it happens that actually buffaloes stray from those protected areas to communal lands. And it's just a matter of time whether they meet cattle or not, and whether they are caught, and they usually, most often, the buffaloes are killed once they stray. So this is how it looks like in reality. So this is the habitat. Here we have fence, here we have communal lands, and this is protected areas. You can see this quite striking how the landscape differs. So we see that communal lands are quite overgrazed, and the protected areas are much more bushy. And actually this fence is in the private game reserve, so it's quite strong and solid looking fence. This area, one of the properties of this area, not this particular area, but in general, savanna in South Africa, is the seasonality. There is quite substantial difference in rainfall between wet season and dry season. They are quite well distinguished. And this also drives the properties of vegetation. So as we can see on those pictures, you can see big difference between wet season with green vegetation providing high quality and usually quite quality and high biomass of fodder, and here is the dry season, which is strikingly different with less nutritious vegetation for herbivores. So now I will talk a little bit about the general approach and methodology to give you a little bit of general perspective on the entire study, which consists on 5 different components. We started with the remotely sensed data on vegetation, with the imagery and acquiring seasonal information on land cover components, and also on vegetation, nitrogen content, and biomass, because this is something, as I said, driving animal behavior. And then we use that to model, together with cattle and buffalo GPS location, to model separately cattle resource use and buffalo resource use. And then for buffaloes, we also, because there is this factor of fence, we also model fence permeability. So how permeable is fence depending on where it's located. And that was one of the factors included in the connectivity modeling. So once we had this resource use for buffaloes, we ran connectivity modeling to actually look at into dispersal of buffaloes from protected areas into communal lands. And we did. And we did the same for cattle. We modeled. It's more of modeling movement of cattle within communal lands. And both those models, intersection of those models, was used to develop those seasonal maps of buffalo cattle contact risk. So that's just general overview. And now I will go through objectives and then each of the components. Now I will go through the components and objectives of each of the components. So the first component was land cover classification. And we focused here on four different objectives. First, we wanted to develop seasonal maps of savanna land cover to distinguish tree, grasses, shrubs, and bare soil mainly. And it's quite challenging in savanna area because of the high heterogeneity of this landscape. So it's very difficult to spectrally distinguish trees from grasses and shrubs. Bare soil it's much easier. Therefore, we need good imagery and very high resolution imagery. And our second objective was to compare different classification approaches, like object-based classification and pixel-based classification, to see which one performs better in this kind of landscape and with certain type of imagery we were dealing with. The third objective was to compare different classification algorithms. And then final objective was to actually look whether in this seasonal habitat where wet season is quite humid and creates a lot of clouds, whether we can use dry season imagery in case wet season imagery is not available or is of a high cloud cover. So we started with Worldview 2 satellite. We had scenes of Worldview 2 for wet and dry season. Worldview 2 has very high spatial resolution of 0.5 meter in panchromatic band and 2 meters in multispectral band. It has quite wide range of spectrum covering 8 spectral bands. So here is the spectrum of the light, and we can here see how Worldview 2 covers the spectrum quite well, actually. So here we have 8 different bands, and especially the red edge band here and the 2 near infrareds are very useful for vegetation classification. That's why we prefer to use Worldview 2 over other satellite products. So we then performed object-based and pixel-based classification. I apologize if that's something you're familiar with, but I will just briefly explain you the difference between those two approaches. So here we have a sample of Worldview 2 image. And this blue area is actually a zoom of this square. And we can actually see that there is a tree, and we can see it here as well. So then when we look into this object even closer, we see that it consists of pixels as well. Each of these pixels has properties, spectral properties, so different values for each of the spectral bands. But we can also, instead of pixel, look at the qualities of the object. So we can actually segment, classify the objects, and we can model the properties of each of the object instead of separate pixels. So this is the difference between pixel-based and object-based approach. So in pixel-based, we look at each pixel, and in object-based, we look at entire properties of an object, which gives us some advantages because we can talk here about texture, neighborhood. I also looked into various classification algorithms. So I investigated 5 of them: k-nearest neighbor, decision trees, random forest, maximum likelihood, and support vector machine. I also tested set of variables which consist of different spectral bands signal, different vegetation indices, different textures variables, both for object-based and pixel-based classification. And for land cover classification, we also need some training and validation data. We had to go to the field, which was quite pleasant, as you can imagine, and we acquired a set of ground truth data from wet and dry season, which was later used for training and validation of our classification models. And here are some results. So this is just for one of the classifiers. This is for object-based classification using random forest. So here we have dry season and here we have wet season. And we have more classes that we are interested in because some of them we had to, we're not really interested, but we need it for continuity of the space for which we want to model movement. And we can clearly see that there are some differences. We have in dry season, we have quite well distinguished burnt areas. And in wet season, we see that there is quite a bit of cloud cover. And here are some numbers. So this is actually to show you the accuracy results. The higher the number, the higher the accuracy, with 100% the perfect accuracy results. And as we can see, object-based classification. So here is overall accuracy, here is kappa. As we can see, for object-based, in general, in dry season, perform better than pixel-based. And we can also see that random forest and support vector machines were superior methods. Same for wet season. Wet season, we can see that the results are even better than for dry season, with maximum of 93% of accuracy, which is quite good for such a fine-scale classification in heterogeneous landscape. And the same pattern here, we can see that object-based performs better comparing to pixel-based, and we can see that random forest and support vector machine is superior to other methods. And then how those results look in relation to our objective. So in general, we acquired quite high accuracy results, regardless of the applied classification approach. So regardless if we use OBIA or pixel-based, for the best classifier, it was accuracy more than 77%, which is not bad. The highest accuracy was achieved using OBIA in wet season, and when applying random forest algorithm, it was accuracy of 93%. When we look into comparing object-based and pixel-based, OBIA object-based classifications performed significantly higher in comparison to pixel-based classification, and that trend was statistically significant in both seasons. And then comparing different classification algorithms, also there was statistically significant trend towards showing that support vector machine and random forest provided highest accuracies for both object and pixel-based approach and for both seasons. And then for the question whether dry season imagery can be alternative for vegetation mapping, although wet season classification performed better, dry season actually was not that bad. It provided accuracy of 83% for support vector machines, which is really not that bad. And it also, which is interesting, in dry season imagery, we were able also with 91% producer accuracy distinguish trees, which is interesting for the trees which are leafless in the dry season. So that's not bad for the dry season. This study was published in 2016 in remote sensing. And now I'm moving to the second component of the contact use model, which focuses on analysis of buffalo space and resource use. So we had 4 objectives here. First was to look into differences in home ranges and core areas in different seasons. Then the second objective was to look into spatial scale of buffalo resource selection. The third objective was to evaluate how quality and quantity of vegetation can affect buffalo space use. And then the final objective, and the most important for our connectivity modeling, was actually to produce buffalo resource use maps for wet and dry season. So we had set of data. We have GPS locations from 6 buffaloes over a period of 1 year with 1 hour temporal resolution. We had remotely sensed data on forage quality represented by nitrogen concentration. And we have also information on biomass. This came from Rapid Eye. And we also had a set of other environmental data like distance to water source, altitude, vegetation types. So the first step was to estimate home ranges and utilization distribution. For that, we used kernel density estimator, which allowed us to produce layer of utilization distribution to actually show us statistically, probabilistically, how much in each pixel, how much each pixel is utilized. And this has been done for each buffalo separately and for each season separately. And thanks to kernel density or utilization distribution surface, we could define home ranges. We define it. So here is an example. So here are the locations of animals. And we could define the 95th percentile, here is the red line, which we consider as a home range. And then we define 75% as a core area, which is the area of high utilization by buffaloes. And then to look into more finer scale, we use the kernel density values as a response variable in our resource utilization model. The second step was to look into seasonal differences of buffalo's home range size and the seasonal overlap between home ranges and core areas. The third step was to estimate scale of fodder selection, and with this we accomplished by using composition analysis and compare the proportion of quality vegetation and high biomass vegetation, compare it within home ranges to the whole entire available area, and then compare it also core areas to home ranges. The fourth step was to look into even finer scale, look into resource utilization, by applying resource utilization model. And for that, we use mixed effect model. As I mentioned before, as a response variable, we use kernel density. Then we use various environmental variables including nitrogen content, biomass, distance to water, vegetation types, altitude. And as a random effect, we use each buffalo, as there might be some differences in buffalo behavior between individuals. So here are results of the resource utilization model. This is our set of competitive models with different interactions between variables. And this is results of the final model, where actually we can see that that buffaloes in the fine scale are selecting for high nitrogen areas, but they're actually avoiding areas of high biomass. And they also, I know that those names are probably not very familiar to some of you, but they basically selecting vegetation types which are considered quite rich in nutrients and on high nutrition soils. And one more point to mention also, they also stayed closer to water. So those are our resulting prediction maps of buffalo resource use for dry season and wet season. So we see that they are quite different. In dry season, they more focus on certain areas of higher nutrition forage and also along the river. So this area here is actually quite a big river called Sabi River. And in the wet season, the distribution of the occurrence of buffaloes, it's more widely, evenly spread across the area. And then again, looking at the results in the context of our objectives, we could see that we found that there is no seasonal difference in buffalo home ranges. And we can actually see that there is some overlap between home ranges and core areas. It's not a huge overlap, 48% for home ranges and only 31% for core areas. So there is some seasonal shift in the area where they forage. And then looking at the spatial scale, we noticed that we found that buffalo actually established their home ranges non-randomly, and then established them in the areas of higher quality and quantity of vegetation. But then in the finer scale, within the home ranges, they actually not selecting for high quantity forage, but they do select for higher quality, which would indicate that in the broader scale, they are more of a bulk grazers. No, they just looking for big quantity of vegetation, but in the finer scale, actually, they might be considered as selective grazers, selective for particular richer vegetation types. And what was interesting also, we found that they selecting areas of higher quality fodder, but farther from water, which might be a result of predation risk. So actually, when they're farther from water, so farther from the higher predation risk, they can focus on browsing areas of more higher with nutrition. This study was published in Ecological Modeling in 2016. And now we're going to move to the third component, which is cattle of the analysis, which is cattle space and resource use. Again, we have three quite similar objectives to the buffalo analysis. So we again wanted to look into seasonal differences between cattle home ranges and core areas. And then we wanted to analyze seasonal differences in cattle resource use, especially focusing on differences in selecting quality and quantity forage, as well as selecting different land cover components between seasons. And then finally, again, most important objective of this part of analysis was to actually acquire special predictions of cattle seasonal resource use, which could later on feed the buffalo cattle contact risk model. So we had set of data we could use. We had data GPS locations from 29 herds. So actually to go more into details, it was not the animals were not colored, but the GPS locations came from the herdsmen, and those 29 herds came from 6 different villages. We had set of remotely sensed data on nitrogen content. So nitrogen content representing quality of forage, and biomass, which represents forage quantity. And this came from our worldview to imagery, and that was seasonal information. We also have land cover components maps for wet and dry season, which came from the first stage of analysis, which I described before. And we have a set of other variables like distance to water, altitude, distance to settlements, which we use, all of that we use into the modeling. So again, for looking into home ranges and seasonal differences in the home range size and core area and home range and core areas overlap, we use kernel density estimator, as it was in case of buffaloes. For fine scale resource utilization in wet and dry season, we used mixed effect model. So the same as in case of buffaloes, but here as a random effect, we use village and not each individual herd, because we believe that villages are the one which might differ in the approach towards using rangelands. So our first results were when the seasonal home ranges and how they overlap. So here we can see in this dark gray, those are the wet season home ranges. The dashed ones are the dry season home ranges. And we can see that there is quite large overlap between those between wet home ranges of wet and dry season. And here are the fine scale resource utilization models for wet season and for dry season. Those are standardized coefficients, so we can see here that that in wet season we have we actually have avoidance or non-selection of areas of high nitrogen or I'm sorry, I think I was muted for a second. So I will just repeat. So in the wet season, cattle was not selected towards high quality fodder or high quantity fodder. However, in dry season, this was we could see quite opposite trend. Cattle would select areas of higher nitrogen content, so richer vegetation, and also vegetation of higher biomass. In both seasons, cattle stayed closer to water, but in the wet season, actually, herdsmen would take cattle farther from settlements. In the dry season, they would stay closer to water. And here are our prediction maps of cattle resource use within communal lands for dry and wet season. So we can clearly see here that they are again. We can see clearly seasonal differences in the space use patterns of cattle and occurrence of cattle. In dry season, they're more concentrated on high quality on areas with high quality vegetation, and also along the river here. And they also stay closer to villages. In wet season, cattle is more spread out. It's very similar as in case of buffaloes, but they also stay close to the water. And how does the results relate to our objectives? So we found that seasonal overlap between home ranges is much higher than in case of buffalo, is 61%. Core areas 49%, as you might remember, for buffaloes it was 31%. So this might lead to overgrazing of areas. It looks like they in quite large extent they're using the same areas across seasons. But we did find statistically significant differences between seasonal home ranges, with smaller home ranges in the dry season. Looking at the resource use, as I mentioned before, cattle selected forage with higher quantity and quality during the dry season. They stayed closer to water in both seasons. And interestingly, they selected trees in the wet season, probably because of the heat in the wet season, so to cool down and maybe also to protect itself from insects. And then looking at the prediction maps, as I mentioned, we could see a quite large seasonal difference in the cattle space use. Dry season, cattle stayed closer to settlements, water sources, and along southern part of the study area, close to the Kruger National Park. This study on cattle was published in 2017 in Agriculture, Ecosystems and Environment Journal. The fourth component of the contact risk model, quite small component but very important, was fence permeability. As I mentioned, fence differs across its length in quality, and in some places it's quite permeable to buffaloes moving through that fence, and buffaloes can quite easily stray through that fence into communal lands. So it's important to know where those areas are. Therefore, we use a modeling. Therefore, we try to model that using data on phase breakages from 2005 to 2013. We applied logistic regression with response variable of probability of fence damage. As variables, we use fence quality, and that actually has quite high impact on first fence permeability. And this is distinguished by whether fence is electrified or non-electrified. The electric fences are of much higher quality comparing to those which are not electrified. Then we also use as a variable human pressure, so number of villagers in each village. We also looked into distance to settlements and whether fence was crossed by the river or not. And here I will just show you how different those fences are along its length. So this is quite good fence along private game reserve, which are much richer in resources comparing to Kruger National Park. So this is electric fence with a little drainage line, which creates a little bit weaker area here. Then if you look at the fences across Kruger National Park, this is electric fence, which looks less solid than the fence I showed you a second ago. And then if you look at places where the fence crosses the river, there's basically no fence. There are just few wires, which has basically 100% permeability for buffaloes moving through such fence. And then here is a damaged fence because of the water drainage, and because it was probably fence near human settlements, and also fence of low quality, not electrified fence. So this so now I'll focus on the last part, the most important part, most important component, which is actually the contact risk model. So in this analytical part, we actually modeled density of movement and dispersal separately for cattle and buffalo. So we wanted to see how cattle moves across the area and how buffalo disperse from protected areas towards communal lands. And for that, we needed set of source points for buffaloes and cattle. We need seasonal landscape resistance, which is also called cost surface. So what it actually is, cost surface evaluates how difficult it is for an animal to move through each pixel of the space, of the landscape, of the raster. So the higher the cost, the more difficult it is for animal to move through the landscape. And then we also had to had to assume the dispersal distance, so how far the animal can move. For source locations for buffaloes, we knew that in our study area there are more or less 3 herds, but this is too little to do this kind of modeling. Therefore, we distributed 150 points. We multiplied those 3 herds by 50, and later on we divided the final results by 50. So this is just a detail, but good to keep in mind. So we distributed those 150 points probabilistically to habitat suitability in the part of the study area within protected lands, because buffaloes, they inhabit protected lands and they stray into communal lands. And for cattle, we actually had numbers of cattle per each village from the census data, and so we distributed those particular number of cattle in each village. And then the resistance layers we acquire through inversion of our resource use layers developed in the previous steps. So we've done it separate for cattle and buffaloes and for each season. And then for buffaloes, we also used this fence permeability. We added up this fence permeability layer, which was also inverted with high cost of movement to high to very strong fence, so low permeability fence, and low resistance, so which allows buffalo to move with a fence of high permeability. And we also tested for different dispersal distances by manipulating, by rescaling our resistance layer, giving it different maximum resistant values. For the modeling density of movement and dispersal, we use cumulative resistant kernels approach. So I'm not sure how familiar you are with connectivity modeling approaches. One of the most well-known is viscous path modeling, and actually the philosophy, the methodology is quite similar here in this case. Just to show you, here is our resource utilization surface. We will look now at this part here. Red area shows low utilization by animals, so animals don't like those areas. Green, towards the green, are highly utilized areas, and the blue areas are areas or no-go, so settlements in our case. And then if we look, so this is the resource utilization. Then from resource utilization, we want to develop resistant surface. So actually, this would be inversion. The areas of low utilization will have, those red areas will have high cost, and the green areas of high utilization we have very low cost. And then what the method does for each source location, it actually runs the cost-weighted, calculates the cost-weighted distance. So multiplies a distance, the shortest cost-weighted distance, the lowest cost-weighted distance. And what is particular about cumulative resistant kernels, this method actually runs those analyses from each source point to each location in the landscape. So basically the destination point is each pixel in the landscape, and then for each source point it applies kernel density, and those kernel surfaces are then summed up for all source points together, and that's our final movement density layer. So just to briefly again go through this contact risk modeling approach. So we have, for cattle, we have resource use layer for wet and dry season separately. We inverted that into cattle resistant surface for wet and dry season. We acquire cattle source points we distributed them in the villages. Then we applied cumulative resistant kernel approach, so to model landscape connectivity, to model cattle movement within communal lands. We acquired layer of movement for wet season and for dry season. And then for buffaloes, approach was almost the same. So again, we used the resource use maps for wet and dry season. We inverted that into resistant surface, but in this case, we also incorporated fence permeability layer. We use buffalo source points we ran cumulative resistant kernel, and we could model the dispersal of buffaloes through protected areas into communal lands. And then multiplication of both of those surfaces gave us maps of buffalo contact risk for wet season and for dry season. So this is how it looks like spatially. This is dispersal layer. So the results of the cumulative resistant kernel analysis for buffaloes, with red areas indicating high density movement, and blue areas indicating that there is very little movement here of buffaloes. We did the same for cattle within communal lands to see density of movement for cattle. Again, red areas indicate high density of movement, blue areas low density of movement. And then multiplication of both of those surfaces gives us the layer of interest, so the layer of buffalo-cattle contact risk. Again, red areas indicate high rate of contact between buffalo and cattle, and blue areas, dark areas here, indicate low risk of contact. So those are our final results. This is contact with layer for wet season and for dry season. This is on the same scale, so we can directly compare those two layers. I'm sorry. So we can clearly see that there are large seasonal differences in buffalo cattle contact risk between wet and dry season. And in dry season, actually, the contact risk is much more concentrated in the southern area along the water, but the risk is also much higher. The values of contact risk are much higher in general. In the wet season, in the wet season here, the risk is more spread across the entire area, more even in this part of the area. There are no huge differences, whereas in the dry season we can see quite striking difference depending on where we are in our study area. And in general, we can see that southern area, this area here, is high risk zone in both seasons, particularly in the dry season. And this is a tricky area because here this is a neighboring area with Kruger National Park, area when the fence is actually quite weak, and also area with some direct neighborhood of villages. And this last component, the contract, was published in Ecography in 2018. And just to give you some general conclusions, so you can take something with you, a few points. Our results of classification heterogeneous landscape of savanna show that object-based classification together with random forest and support vector machines provide the best results. So it's advised to use object-based classification with random forest or support vector machines if you want to classify, to get the best results for land cover classification in savanna. Then the wet season imagery actually was provided better results in classification, no matter which classifier we used or which classification method we use. However, dry season imagery can be also applied in case when wet season imagery has high cloud cover or is clear or is simply not available. We also found that buffalo, we also spoke and found that buffalo resource selection is scale dependent. So in the larger context, they behave more like a bulk feeder, so they're not very selective, but actually in a fine scale, they're selecting forage of high quality and not only focusing on the biomass, on the quantity. Cattle selects quality and high quantity forage, but only in the dry season. In wet season, they were not selective. So basically, they were just spread out over the area without selecting any particular forage. we also find out that that there is quite high overlap between cattle home ranges, seasonal home ranges, which would indicate that the communal lands, this particular communal lands, are quite susceptible to overgrazing, which might be a future problem. We already seen it on the image that this area is quite overgrazed. And then our contact risk analysis, the final contact risk layers showed us the high seasonal difference in contact risk, which is quite important outcome for veterinary services to allocate their resources, and they should take that into account. That actually the risk is not the same depending on the season, and it's also spatially diverse. With southern area being a zone of permanent higher risk. Thank you. I know that it was quite a lot of information, and I hope it was not. I hope you could follow. I hope I didn't make it too complicated. If yes, I apologize. It's quite late for me. If you have any questions, please feel welcome to ask me, and you are also welcome to contact me under this email. Thank you very much once more.